Welcome to Creating Presence. I'm Dr. Sandra Bloom, and I'm here with my co-host, Sarah Yanosy.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Sandy.
Hi, Sarah. We've spent, she and I, the last 25 years working with leaders across the United States and around the world to build trauma-informed workplaces and in the hopes of transforming service delivery for nonprofit and government and for-profit organizations that exist in some way to help people or to help our society. In this podcast, we share our insights and our experiences and our knowledge in the hopes of inspiring leaders and other professionals to really put these ideas into practice.
Today, since we're seeing a specific set of problems arise in organizations as well as in whole countries, including ours, Sandy and I have decided that we want to focus on authoritarianism and a concept that's been called bogus empowerment.
Yeah, I think concepts that we've had personal experience with as well.
Yes.
The nature of people who were really defined and recognized as highly authoritarian was studied in the late 1940s, the end of World War II, after Hitler's totalitarian regime had caused such enormous global suffering. I mean, we're talking 40 to 50 million people who were killed. So most recently, Dr. Robert Altemeyer has been studying and researching authoritarian behavior for the last several decades. And his work really focuses a light on the central cognitive thinking problems in authoritarian behavior that actually pose really significant challenges when people high in these traits become employed pretty much anywhere, but particularly in the mental health and the social service systems.
Yeah, Altermeyer noted three fundamental and interrelated characteristics of people who are high in authoritarian traits. The first is authoritarian submission, and he described this as people who have a high degree of submission to the authorities who are perceived to be established and legitimate in the society that you live in. Authoritarian aggression is the second, and that is a general aggressiveness directed against various persons that's perceived to be sanctioned by established authorities. And then the third is conventionalism. And this is a high degree of adherence to the social conventions that are perceived to be endorsed by society and its established authorities. And these characteristics are both significant and dangerous for human service environments, especially when people who are high in authoritarianism traits achieve consequential levels of power over other people, meaning clients and staff.
Yeah, people who are high, for example, in authoritarian submission generally just accept the statements and actions of established authorities and believe that those authorities should be trusted and that they deserve both obedience and respect because of their position. And they place really narrow rights on other people's rights to criticize those same authority figures. And they tend to assume that anybody that criticizes the authority figures are just fundamentally just wrong. And as they see it, criticism of established authority is divisive and destructive, and that it's motivated by nothing except a desire to cause trouble. And for such people, when authority figures actually break the law, they have an inherent right to do so, even if the rest of us can't do the same actions.
So, people who are high in authoritarian aggression are predisposed to control other people through the use of punishment. So, that's how you'll know, that's how you'll recognize that trait. And these are people who typically would advocate for physical punishment in childhood and even beyond. They dismiss or even deplore any form of leniency towards people who diverge from the established authority. And they're also the ones who would advocate for capital punishment. The other thing is that unconventional people or anyone who's considered to be socially deviant, and I think, in these terms, thinking about what's happening politically right now, the way that authoritarianism shows up in regard to conversations about people in the trans community, um, you know, that they're believed to be a threat to the social order, and therefore aggression towards them is justified, particularly if it's condoned by authority figures.
Yeah. It does feel like this is what we're living through now. Conventionalism indicates a strong acceptance of and a commitment to whatever the traditional social norms are of whatever society we're talking about. And anything that is based on longstanding tradition and custom and that maintains the beliefs and the teachings and the services in their traditional form is preferred. So such people reject the idea that people should derive their own moral beliefs to meet the needs of today, because moral standards have already been established by authority figures of the past and therefore should be obeyed without question. So this requires things like endorsing a traditional family structure within which women are subservient to men and they keep their place, and that the only proper marriages are between men, genetic men, and genetic women.
Yeah.
And other ways of doing things are simply wrong and dangerous. Such people then are very offended and outraged at the ideas that men could marry men and women could marry women, or really any variation in the traditional descriptions of relationships between men and women, even though those definitions, if we go back into our deep past, were not the same. But
Right.
in everybody's living memory, that's the way things have been.
Yeah, it's like that idea that something is right because it's the way we've always done it, even though new evidence tells us that it might not be right. But for all the social problems, and I think you've highlighted a bunch, that are connected to this extreme authoritarian behavior, it's actually the impact on mental health and behavior that's associated with authoritarianism that has the most bearing on the functioning of our mental health systems. In investigating the cognitive behavior of authoritarianism, Altermeyer found that authoritarians actually don't spend much time examining evidence, thinking critically, reaching independent conclusions, or seeing whether their conclusions even match other things that they believe. They largely accept what authority figures have told them is true, and they have really a hard time identifying falsehoods on their own. They just copy other people's opinions without critically evaluating them, as long as those opinions are coming from somebody who has established authority. So, sheep, right? Kind of
It's a
following
huge
whatever you're
problem.
told.
And it's a brain thing. When we talk about cognitive problems, we're talking about the way their brains work. So they end up believing a whole bunch of contradictory things without even being able to see the contradictions. They don't mentally reverse situations and put themselves in the other person's shoes, which is absolutely critical if you're going to work on any kind of resolution of a conflict in an organization, in your family, wherever. You've got to be able to listen to the other person and understand where they're coming from. They can't do that. They examine ideas less than other people, and they tend to surround themselves only with people who agree with them and never contradict them. they show a very hefty double standard when testing whether something is true or not. So if evidence supports what they believe, they accept it unquestioningly as truth. If the evidence fails to support what they believe, then they throw out the evidence.
Right.
So since they tend not to be able to think very well, and certainly not independently, they're vulnerable to mistaken judgments and can be astonishingly gullible when some kind of insincere, deceitful communicator, but someone who bears the trapping of authority, tells them something, and they'll just believe it.
Yeah. I think about, watching interviews with people who have been attending, political rallies, and just the stark clarity of that in action. But it really reflects an inability to think critically, to synthesize information, and to look for diverse sources of information. And that's a really big handicap when we're applying kind of this lens to the work with people in human services, our social services and mental health systems, because the people that we serve have really complex physical, psychological, social, and moral challenges related to their exposure to trauma, repetitive stress, and violence. So, if authoritarian leaders end up in key administrative positions in those organizations, the result is likely to be really problematic, and a significant barrier to doing trauma informed practice, because those people are going to be unwilling to shift away from what are now like fundamentalist explanations of emotional problems. And we see that in the DSM, right? The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, that sort of describes the symptoms, the etiology, and tries to help us make sense of uh, people's mental health problems.
So true. There are strong links between authoritarianism and all kinds of fundamentalist belief systems, meaning any literal-minded philosophy with the pretense of being the sole source of objective truth forever, for all time, for everyone, in all places. Whether it's under the umbrella of religion or politics or whatever. Fundamentalism always requires people to reject information that is or may be inconsistent with whatever the established dogma is. And this is extremely dangerous position to take when it comes to dealing with our current world situation and the complexity associated with trying to help what are really complex and very diverse human systems to heal, so that we could, help this changing world actually to survive. And that's what makes this rise of authoritarianism and fundamentalism so incredibly dangerous. It's almost like a prescription for complete annihilation of life on the planet.
Well, and it also, sort of has this trickle down effect. So leaders who are high in authoritarian traits are likely to insist on a centralized and traditional hierarchy. They discourage participation, true participation. And when we see this in organizations, that means staff participation. They can't really facilitate team treatment. They punish people who dissent, and they surround themselves with people who agree with their worldview. So it's, kind of that echo chamber effect that we've talked about in other podcasts. Authoritarian leadership then encourages that same style throughout the organization. So it almost has a snowball effect.
As a result, the organizational norms for all staff are likely then to endorse punitive behavior, empathic failure, and traditional methods for managing difficult situations. And with all that, it's pretty hard to imagine a situation more detrimental to long-lasting positive change in the lives of trauma survivors and really in the lives of all of us. As for the staff, when authoritarian behavior comes to dominate a situation, the result can also be devastating. Unchecked authoritarians at whatever level they exist can become bullies at any organizational level, and when they're given power, they can become petty tyrants.
Yeah, this issue of workplace bullying is a pretty significant one. And research is showing us, what a significant problem it is in our systems. And what it really means is repeated and persistent negative acts towards one or more individuals, which involve a perceived power imbalance and create a hostile work environment. And this can show up in a lot of different ways. Sometimes, there are definitions that include the systematic persecution of a colleague, a subordinate, or a superior, which, if it's continued, will cause more severe social, psychological, and even physical psychosomatic problems for the victim.
Yeah, we did an earlier podcast on bullying, but it's just worthwhile kind of reviewing what bullying behaviors can include because it's pretty expansive. Things like socially isolating people, or giving people the silent treatment, spreading rumors, attacking the victim's private life or their attitudes or just the way they look, excessive criticism or monitoring of somebody's work, like always standing over their shoulder and criticizing what they're doing, withholding information, depriving another person, particularly a subordinate, of any responsibility and being verbally aggressive. It may include changing work tasks or making them really difficult to perform. Personal attacks on the person's private life through ridicule or insults or gossip, verbally humiliating workers in public, and threats of violence. All are part of the whole spectrum of bullying behaviors. And the main difference between what we think of as normal conflict and bullying is not necessarily what and how it is done, but rather the frequency and the longevity of what is done and the power differential that exists between people, because the underling cannot really protect themselves.
Yeah, we've known for a while about how the organizational culture plays a role in whether or not bullying happens. And there's some really interesting research that was done by a researcher named Brodsky, who concluded that in order for harassment to occur, there must be elements within the organizational culture that permit it or even reward it. And bullying only can occur if the offender believes that he or she has the overt, or more usually the covert, support from superiors for this behavior.
Yeah, that's so important because it's organizational tolerance or the lack of sanctions against bullying really gives implicit permission for the bullying to continue. So aggressive or predatory behavior that starts on a one-to-one level, just with one person, can end up splitting a whole organization into opposing camps. And conditions that serve as enabling structures and processes that make it possible for bullying to occur include things like power imbalances between the victim and the perpetrator, low perceived costs of bullying from the point of view of the perpetrator, and dissatisfaction and frustration that's widespread in the workplace. It's almost like a virus that gets into the system, and once it's there, it can wreak havoc.
Yeah, so we've sort of talked about the cognitive process, the individual person, having these characteristics or traits around authoritarianism that cause this vulnerability. But then there's also some research that was done by Lehman and Gustafson, who pointed out that it, not just in the individual, but in the culture, in the climate of the organization, these four key factors that elicit bullying behavior at work. The first is deficiencies in work design. Two is deficiencies in leadership behavior. The third is a socially exposed position of the victim or the target of the bullying. And four is low moral standards in the organization.
Yeah. Unhealthy environments. They lend themselves to the emergence of what really needs to be called toxic leaders. Toxic leaders are subtly or maybe overtly abusive, violating the basic standards of human respect and courtesy and civility and rights of the people who report to them. They tend to be power hungry and appear to feed off the use and abuse of the power they have. They play to people's basest fears. They stifle criticism and teach followers to do the same behavior and never to question their judgment or their actions. They lie to meet their own ends, and they tend to subvert processes of the system that are really intended to generate a more honest and open environment. And they compete with instead of nurturing other people, including potential successors. And they tend to use these constant divide and conquer strategies to set people against each other. And these have all become social norms at this point in America. I mean, it is throughout social media, on television. This is what you see happening and how people are behaving with a complete lack of civility and respect.
Well, and it's funny because you would think this would be pretty easy to see. I mean, you and I see it pretty clearly. But often what happens is these toxic leaders will find a scapegoat and then they'll direct their followers' aggression against that person or that group in order to distract from their own misbehavior. And they frequently promote, in organizations, incompetence, corruption, and cronyism. And we see this in government too. And then they exploit these systems for their own personal gain.
We have both seen our share of toxic leaders in organizations. God, in for-profit companies, toxic leaders may eventually get outed because they have such a detrimental effect on worker morale and ultimately then on the bottom line. But unfortunately, in the public and nonprofit sector, toxic leaders can hide for a very long time because their impact is often less directly tied to inefficiency or negative behavior on the part of workers. And they can wreak havoc on an organization because they are the mediators between the organization and the board of directors who are supposed to be responsible for the functioning of the organization. And so it's pretty easy for them, I've watched this happen, to corrupt the board of directors who then are supposed to be in charge of curbing this kind of behavior. And it's slow for it to be surfaced in the nonprofit world.
Yeah. And often what happens is that the workers are scapegoated. So there's kind of a lack of ability to understand or judge outcomes based on workers or consumer satisfaction. And that creates situations where, we don't even know what managers are supposed to be accountable for, except for command and control. And that's what supports the, behavior, and that leads to toxic leadership.
And under what is arguably the worst conditions, an organizational leader who's predisposed to authoritarian behavior and having more and more power in the first place may really evolve into what we've called a petty tyrant. So a petty tyrant is somebody who arbitrarily and in a small-minded way exercises absolute power oppressively and sometimes even brutally. Petty tyrants believe certain things about their employees, a set of beliefs that's been called Theory X. And what constitutes Theory X is a belief that the average person doesn't want to work, they're lazy, they dislike work, they don't have ambition, they don't want responsibility, they prefer a director, and they're resistant to change. And if you don't tell them what to do and punish them for not doing it, then everything will get worse. And these ideas go back at least to the 1950s, but I'd say, they're pretty much centuries old.
Yeah, and it makes sense that, we end up with these concentrations of power, partly because organizations grow over time. And that means that, we can't have the direct participation of every staff person. So we start to add layers of bureaucracy. Um, and also, it makes sense because there's so much extraordinary pressure on our organizations. They have to change rapidly, compete in a, global structure, and they have to survive in what's an exceedingly stressful world climate. We talked about terror management in one of our previous podcasts. And so that tells us that a primary role of our culture, including the organizational culture, is to manage the existential terror whenever there's a fear of or threat. And that the response is to increase centralization of control, diminish the likelihood of democratic participation. Democratic participation is always really complex, it's messy, and it's inherently full of conflicts.
Time itself can pose barriers to democratic workplaces. Time to engage in the process is necessary to really encourage and support participatory processes and therefore the longevity of the organization. Currently, sustaining democratic processes requires charismatic leaders who inspire the change necessary for individuals and groups to move beyond bureaucratic, hierarchical, top-down control structures to more flattened hierarchies and democratic participation. Inadequate succession plans often leave organizations barren of information and clear mission once the charismatic leader is gone. So it has to be passed on and delivered to the next generation.
Thanks for listening to Creating Presence. After the break, Sandy and I are going to talk about partnerism, which is an economic model that we think has some really interesting applications for disrupting authoritarian structures. We'll talk more also about the concept of bogus empowerment, and we'll be back after these messages.
In a world with trauma, adversity, and mental health deficits, your organization may be feeling the effects in its culture. Recognizing the need for safe, productive, and values-aligned organizations, Creating Presence can help to develop a healthy, biocratic organization. In the Creating Presence training model, your entire staff will learn to value human elements that characterize organizations, learn values that are solution-based and supportive, and implement new skills which will create capable leaders to meet the needs of staff and clients. For more information, go to www.creatingpresence.net. Creating Presence is managed by Lakeside, your resource for trauma-responsive care.
Welcome back to Creating Presence. I'm Dr. Sandra Bloom, and I'm here with my co-host, Sarah Yanosy. We're going to continue our discussion about bogus empowerment and suggest the use of something called partnerism as an antidote.
Yeah, we were talking about, when organizations get bigger, we often see efforts at standardization that are implemented to kind of make things more consistent and manageable. So bureaucracies are often put in place in order to create order as organizations, get older and grow. But frequently, the bureaucracies that were originally intended to kind of maintain deeply democratic, egalitarian structures, they get depersonalized and dehumanized with the concentration of power. And that tends to diminish or destroy participatory processes. And we can see this in a lot of social service, mental health programs, and institutions where the initial organizational vision was really revolutionary. But over time, and as a result of neglect and increasing stress, they become stagnant bureaucracies that actually dehumanize the workers and the clients alike.
Yeah, and you've heard me talk about, Sarah, about organizations as living systems, and living systems, like living people, need to be fed. And as various leaders and orators have reminded us in America over the years, the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. Democracy, at least in our present state of evolutionary development, is fragile. It can be easily killed. It has to be fed all the time. An organizational scholar, Professor George Cheney, he observed it this way. He said, a question persists about what, if anything, a specific organization can do over time to resist the temptation to formalize, centralize, standardize, and otherwise reduce the spontaneous and dynamic aspects of life within it. In any event, collective and careful reflection on the goals and practices of non-traditional democratic organizations must be a regular part of an organization's decision-making process. And for us in creating presence, that becomes really central.
Yeah. We're talking about workplace participation, and that can mean a lot of things, but unfortunately, democratic participation in the workplace is often a cover for authoritarian leadership structures. I see this in the organizations that I coach all the time. Staff will say things like, they ask for our opinion, they send out surveys, but then they do what they were going to do anyway. Very few organizations actually allow employees at all levels to have a voice in shaping or influencing policy. And as a result, employees who are promised these participatory structures, they get disillusioned pretty quickly. Quality circles and other programs like that are supposed to create these opportunities are often used like to pacify people and to diffuse any potential resistance to employment practices that are probably kind of harsh, maybe even abusive. But, having these groups in place is sort of supposed to quell that frustration that comes along with it.
And this kind of behavior is not limited to the for-profit sector or to, fundamentalist organizations. Dr. Cheney describes his involvement in a story he tells about being involved with a large and highly visible peace movement dedicated to ending the nuclear arms race during the 80s that conducted its meetings as monologues, with the director barking out orders, dictating entirely the flow and specific nature of work, unilaterally assigning all roles and tasks, and pressuring paid staff and volunteers to work unreasonably long hours, all of which Cheney interpreted as a kind of organizational violence. But when he was confronted, the director refused to recognize these really painful contradictions between the organization's mission and the way it actively acted internally. All he could say was that the ends of the organization entirely justified the means.
I've seen this too. For many years, I worked in an organization that was dedicated to, helping children and families. And my partner would say, like, can you take a day off? Or like, can you stay home because the kids are sick? And I'd say, like, I cannot take a day off when the kids are sick. That's against our organizational policy. And she would be like, don't you work for an organization that helps children and families? Like, what about your children and your family? But I've seen it, too, with things like DEI committees that meet and make recommendations, and then those recommendations kind of just disappear into the ether. So I'm sure our listeners have lots of examples of this too. Um, the term that's used for worker empowerment that isn't really empowering anybody is bogus empowerment. And the definition of bogus empowerment is the use of therapeutic fictions to make people feel better about themselves, to eliminate conflict and satisfy their desire to belong, so that they will freely choose to work toward the goals of the organization and be productive.
Leaders who offer this kind of bogus empowerment are really unauthentic and insincere and disrespectful of other people. They believe that they can change other people without changing themselves. So, what does true empowerment look like? I mean, when you empower others, you do at least one of the following. You help them recognize the power that they already have. You help them recover power that they once had and lost, or you give them the power that they've never had before.
Yeah, there's a researcher named Richard Cuoto, and he studied grassroots organizations. And he says there are two main kinds of empowerment. The first he calls psychopolitical empowerment. This increases people's self-esteem and results in a change in the distribution of resources and or the actions of others. So in other words, empowerment entails the confidence, the desire, and most important, the ability of people to bring about real change. And this is what most people, I think of when they hear the term empowerment. But he also calls the second form of empowerment psychosymbolic empowerment. And I think another word that you and I would probably use and our listeners might be more familiar with is like performative empowerment, right? Like this raises people's self-esteem or their ability to cope with what's basically an unchanged set of circumstances. And more often than not, leaders promise or appear to promise psychopolitical empowerment, but actually deliver psychosymbolic or performative empowerment.
Yeah, psychosymbolic empowerment can become just another form of manipulation in service of authoritarian values, just a little more subtle than the use of actual force. And Americans can easily be drawn into notions of empowerment because we are known, supposedly, to treasure democracy and its accompanying values of liberty and equality. But if Americans walk the talk about democracy, we would have the most democratic workplaces in the world, but we don't. And money would not determine our elections as it does. Democratic participation is difficult, and it requires really sophisticated social skills that children are not being taught. Empowerment doesn't just mean people assuming power over or with other people or organization. It also means, well, let's underscore this, the assumption of more responsibility. Democratic processes are messy and often really disordered, at least for a while. Tom Wren points out, ever since American independence, there's been a conflict between the values of equality and authority.
It's so complicated because, we value individualism and freedom, but that really creates challenge for leadership and organizations. And it becomes kind of this idea of leading a flock of cats versus, like leading a flock of sheep. And when we're trying to harness engagement and hoping that people are going to assume more of that responsibility, it does feel more like herding cats. And so, because that's hard, leaders often they prefer and then try to structure a situation that feels more like leading sheep. And in the world of for-profit business, the issue of participation and order are frequently in total conflict because getting a job done and making money trumps everything else. If we're using a market economy, when making profit is more important than the means and the people who get it done, then leadership is only effective if it gets profitable results, right? If it's, making money. And we talked a little bit about like the shimmer effect in our previous podcast. This, a leader who seems very attractive to the board of directors because they are, it looks like they'll be able to make more money, and profit really drives that shimmer effect. And in this kind of cultural framework, there really isn't a lot of room for things that have intrinsic value, but they don't necessarily serve the interests of profit, and so they get left behind.
And although financial profitability is supposedly not the main motivator in many components of the social service delivery system, what has become really extreme rationalization of services over the last decades and continues and is getting worse with every day, has compelled organizations to employ many of the same tactics and strategies as a for-profit, market-driven economy, just to stay afloat. But lacking the corrective of competition and the tangible assessment instrument of profitability or even consumer satisfaction, social service organizations have no real measure for whether or not what they are doing is actually effective, and effective for whom.
Yeah, I think about so many nonprofits who have hired CEOs from, the corporate sector as part of their way of trying to survive. And then, the criteria for service delivery ends up being things like, how adequate is your paperwork? What are recidivism numbers? How many home visits have been made? But does paperwork actually have anything to do with whether or not a client improved? Does it mean that service delivery was a failure if someone comes back to your program after they've been discharged? Does it mean it was a success? Like we don't capture that in any way that's really meaningful. Does the number of visits made have anything to do with whether children are being adequately protected? When we think about, how we look at preventive services, maybe, but maybe not. Where we end up looking at outputs instead of outcomes, because of that's, kind of the economic model that we're applying. But when we're dealing with really chronic, complex problems, and particularly things like prevention, it's really difficult to assess effectiveness, right? Because we can't prove a negative. We can't, look at a family and articulate that we've prevented something from happening, or kept it from getting worse, because we don't really have ways of measuring that. And so, to some degree, these are the inherent problems of doing the work that we do in human services.
In the mental health system, the desire for empowerment has arisen out of the multiple historical abuses of the mentally ill, which is related to a lot of what you were just talking about, Sarah. The consumer-driven movement seeks to empower clients to determine what is effective treatment for them and what is not. And unfortunately, it's impossible to have a democratic system where only one component of the system has a voice. It's time to move beyond just client empowerment and include staff empowerment. And to do that, we'll need leaders in our social service system who have learned the skills of democratic leadership, which we believe a good example comes in the form of what's being called partnerism.
Yeah. We've been talking about what happens in human service institutions, and we can see that so much of what we're describing is rooted in the foundations of domination as part of our social structure. And I was actually responding, Sandy, as you were talking about, consumers defining what treatment is for them, and that what an important movement that is. But the barrier that's been put in place is, what if insurance companies won't pay for what clients think is effective treatment, right? So there are all of these conflicts that come up. So in creating presence, we work a lot on knowledge and skill acquisition, as well as policy and practice alignment. And so when we're thinking about this idea of partnerism that you mentioned, right, it's technically an economic model. But I think there are a lot of really strong parallels and applications to how it can help us define trauma-informed practice.
Yeah, partnerism recognizes that our real wealth consists of the contributions of people and of nature. It demonstrates that to move toward a more sustainable and just social system, we have to implement economic measurements, policies, and practices that recognize the enormous value of the essential work of caring for people, starting in early childhood, and caring for our natural life support systems. And there are 5 basic areas of application. And we'll give some examples of policies that have been successful in other countries that demonstrate what this might look like.
Yeah, so the first area of application is developing new metrics for economic success. So in countries that have been doing this, that means looking at child poverty rates, enrollment in early childhood education, gender and racial equality, educational attainment, ecological deficits and returns, public spending on family benefits, funding for childcare and education, and government and business investment in environmental protection. So it's fascinating, right? They're not just looking at GDP, they're looking at investments and the outcomes of those investments. So when we think about what this might look like in our organizations, first thing that comes to mind for me is like, it is not constant expansion and conglomeration, right? That bigger is better mentality that we see in so many of our hospitals and mental health systems, just constant growth and expansion. Instead, that would look like asking, have we made investments in employee retention, staff and client satisfaction, quality of care, providing a living wage for the people who work for us? These are some of the things that we would look at as economic benchmarks. And that means you can't just look at the bottom line of a spreadsheet, right? And we talk a lot about this in the skills around complexity management that we teach in creating presence. So we're sort of setting the stage for shifting this.
Yeah, I think what our listeners have to realize is that we are currently under a regime of neoliberal economics, and it means that the only job of corporations is to make profit for their shareholders, period. And that has created enormous problems. So the second part of partnerism is ending the disproportionate poverty of women and children and penalizing activities that are harmful or useless to our nation's well-being. This currently does not happen. These can be funded by increasing financial penalties for businesses that engage in activities that harm people and harm the environment, and instead developing what's been called a caring economy. which we'll look at in a minute. But what might this look like for organizations? Living wages for care providers, access to health care, mental health, paid time off, lowering the wage gap between highest and lowest paid employees.
Yeah, the third is implementing a cohesive family policy agenda, right? And this is, I sort of mentioned this earlier about, I work in a family-focused organization, caring for other people's families when my own family is, it doesn't, kind of getting second shrift. What that might look like at the organizational level are things like parental leave, stipends to help families raise their children, providing elder care with dignity, universal health care, quality childcare, and other kind of caring policies. In organizations, this looks like creating flex time, having a space for breastfeeding. I remember when I was nursing, I had to pump in a bathroom or in a utility closet. Things like remote work, and creating steps or qualifications to help professionalize caregiving staff, and paying them in accordance with the value that they're providing.
The fourth is demonstrating the economic return from investing in caring for people and nature. So parental leave, sick leave, flex time, and other caring policies have a higher yield to investors. It also shows that these policies provide nations with a path to be equitable and have thriving economies. And what might this look like for organizations? Well, taking care of our workers and their children leads to better health outcomes. So they're less taxing on our human service systems. And then working together to shift social institutions and values from domination to partnership is critical. These laws against violence against children that have been in effect for a couple decades were pioneers in the first peace studies programs. And since it is in early family relations that children first learn whether or not it's okay to use violence to impose their will on other people, nonviolence in families and in the family of nations are inextricably interconnected.
Yeah, when I think about this idea of shifting our values from domination to partnership, our work with creating presence really helps us kind of create some foundation for that too. We are teaching staff and leaders about brain regulation, about group engagement, about communication skills, in addition to those complexity management skills that kind of connect to some of these other parts of partnerism. And I think it's fascinating that so many of the people that I'm working with and in coaching share with me that like they're using these skills at work, but they are also using these skills at home, in their families, and sort of shifting the dynamics there as well. Because what we see is that what happens in our families and in our communities plays out in our helping systems, and it plays out in the experiences that people have as employees in their organizations, and those replicate each other generation to generation.
Yeah, the reality is we can't meet our unprecedented environmental, economic, and social challenges with the same thinking that created them. The mix of high tech and domination systems that's been in play for a couple thousand years is causing terrible damage. And then on top of this, there is a massive regression to uncaring, abusive policies and practices. And this makes the need for a new economic system that, unlike capitalism and socialism, requires and rewards the essential work of caring for nature and for people more urgent than ever before. Our current technological dislocations are a crisis, but they're also an opportunity to develop the new economic paradigm of partnerism.
Redefining economic success, seeing ourselves as part of the caring economy, aligning our internal organizational policies with partnerism, and building democratic functions as part of defining our economic practices and metrics can help protect against autocratic leadership, petty tyrants, and those toxic cultures that we talked about so much in our previous segment.
And we are rapidly approaching an economic tipping point. Millions of jobs have already been replaced by automation, robotics, and AI. And predictions are that job losses will accelerate exponentially in the next 20 years. And this opens the door for redefining what is and is not productive work as part of a new, more sustainable and equitable economic system.
Thanks so much for listening to Creating Presence. Join us next week when Sandy and I will talk more about what it means to create a healthy society. You can reach us at creatingpresence.net or voiceamerica.com. See you next week.